Hi, guys. Welcome to our end of 2020 celebration. Yes, it's waxing on, and it's our year-end episode. And it's actually episode 100. If you can imagine, 100 episodes since last May. So today what we're going to do is we're going to just take a look at the year in review. What have we looked at over the last year? I started the program in May 2020. We were in the middle of the pandemic, all in lockdown. And I thought it'd be interesting just to go back through my vinyl record collection and take a look at some of the albums I've collected over the years and maybe make some recommendations for people to listen to while they're at home. So we started out with albums. We kind of branched into CDs. All my cassettes are someplace, I don't know, so we kind of skipped that cassette and 8-track era. And I think we found a good cross-section of music. Now, the idea was not to focus on any particular style. So we covered a lot of ground. We covered jazz. We covered classic rock. And on Fridays, we would have a mix of a lot of different things. It was folk music. It might have been country music. Sometimes it was those artists, and I'll just give you a couple off the top of my head, of Lyle Lovett, Mary Chapin Carpenter, Nancy Griffith, that were categorized as one thing, and a lot of times it was country, but I saw them more just as singer-songwriters that had their own voice, their own style, and really grew outside of those the confines of that categories. We looked at spoken word with William S. Burroughs, if you can imagine, the legend of the beat era. We had classical music, we had new wave music with Elvis Costello, Bram Tchaikovsky, Any Trouble. A lot of various types of recordings. So it wasn't just restricted to one thing. Now, what surprised me over the year is there was a lot of them that I didn't think were going to do that well or that nobody would know. And boy, was I shocked. So what I thought I'd start out with first to get us kicked off is the Waxing On Top 10. So here's our top 10 clips that were viewed this year. Number 1 was Janis Joplin. And we focused on her earlier years, the pre-Pearl albums. Specifically, I was looking at one called Cheap Thrills that she did with Big Brother and the Holding Company in San Francisco. Artwork on the cover, you can see by Art Crumb. Again, just an icon of that era. We had some classic Joplin tunes in there. Piece of My Heart, Ball and Chain. There was really some great stuff. And it was one of probably her last album with Big Brother, but she did some great work with that band. Number 9 on our list was the man who put classic back in classic rock. It was the killer, Jerry Lee Lewis. And the album we focused on with this one was duets, where Jerry Lee had recorded a number of duets with some of rock's more current performers. And again, this did really well in our viewing. A lot of people really enjoyed getting some Jerry Lee back in there. Number 8 was one that I think is a classic. I mean, this lady's been one of my favorites for over 50 years. She's done country, she's done rock, she's done Broadway. There's nothing that she hasn't done and nothing she hasn't done excellently. And of course, I'm talking about Linda Ronstadt. We looked at her greatest hits, we looked at some of the other albums she put out, but since the 1970s, she's just been a superstar. And again, a lot of the albums we're looking at were in the early era because we were looking at vinyl. Number 7 on our list was a guy who's still going strong. Excuse me. I just saw him a couple weeks ago on Saturday Night Live, and of course I'm talking about Bruce Springsteen. Now, while I enjoyed the Saturday Night Live performances, it didn't match up to what some of the stuff I really enjoyed from the early years. So we were focusing on early Springsteen in our clips. We looked at the Born to Run album and one of my favorites, Darkness on the Edge of Town. Now, Born to Run, I mean, that song's just a classic that there's nothing you can say about it. It's just perfect. When I looked at the album, Darkness on the Edge of Town, there were 4 songs on that album that if that was all the Springsteen I could have, that would be enough. We had Badlands, Promised Land, Racing in the Streets, Darkness on the Edge of Town. And to me, those 4 songs defined the whole Springsteen experience for me. It was just a great album. Number 6 was from the British Invasion. We looked at the Beatles, the 6th most popular video we had. And of course, we have the whole catalog we kind of touched on in there. And again, just for some recommendations, if I could only have 3 Beatle albums, it would be easy. Meet the Beatles from the early era. The Beatles' White Album, which I think was just a classic. I mean, I had that on disc, I had it on cassette, I had it on CD, and I have it digitally now. I mean, I just can't get away from that album. And the other one of mine that's been on all of my formats was Let It Be. Just a classic album. And those 3 Beatle albums, for me, are some of the best work they had done. And if you haven't checked them out, give them a listen. Okay, then we moved into the top 5. And surprisingly, a lot more jazz in the top 5. The first one, at number 5, was Maynard Ferguson, trumpet player from Verdun, Quebec. Maynard, we didn't look at a lot of early albums. I touched on one called Screamin' Blues that he had done back before, I guess, the M.F. Horn years. And then we looked at Live at Jimmy's, M.F. Horn 4 and 5, and Chameleon. And that was kind of the last one that he recorded with his actual band. We got into trying to think of the one that came after that. Well, anyways, let's say Chameleon was the last one. It'll come to me in a moment. Bob James produced the next one, and they started using studio musicians instead of the actual band for the recording. That was called Primal Scream. I knew Scream was in there somewhere, just had to figure out where. Before that, like Live at Jimmy's and Chameleon, he was recording with the band he was touring with. So what you saw in the concert was the same thing that was recorded on the recordings. By the time we got into Primal Scream, he started using some other studio musicians. And don't get me wrong, I love the studio musicians. That's really what led into some of the other albums that we're going to talk about. But it wasn't the same as hearing the band. These otherwise were almost like live recordings. So yeah, Maynard Ferguson in at number 5. Number 4 was another one of my favorites, and somebody that I had gone to see a number of times, was Chuck Mangione. And in there, we focused mainly on the Mercury years, that first few recordings he had done, Friends in Love, Together, Live, a great quartet recording that he did with the group. And those albums, which were very different from the A&M years, which were really different from the Columbia years. So if you haven't had a chance to go back and check out early Chuck Mangione, those are ones that I was first introduced to his music with. He was performing a lot in Toronto at the time. We were going to live concerts that were in the scale of the Friends in Love and Together, large orchestras, special guests coming in. But I've also seen him in the quartet setting in the same thing. Once we got to the A&M, it was a little more commercial, but still a very good band. Columbia, the music changed quite a bit. So if you get a chance, go back and take a look at the video and maybe check out some of that early music. Number 3 was one that was a bit of a surprise to me. I had 2 albums that were recorded by Creed Taylor Records out of New Jersey. And in the 70s, Creed Taylor put out a couple of, a number of albums with jazz players. And he brought in a lot of studio musicians. And these were one of the reasons I bought these albums, was because of all the studio players. And being a trumpet player, I was really excited to see the number of New York trumpet players that I wouldn't hear anywhere else. We had John Faddis, you got Alan Rubin, Marvin Stamm, all these guys, Lou Soloff, playing background with these groups, and Bob James was one of them. And Creed Taylor was also integrating a lot of classical music in with the jazz music. Now, Bob James, I thought, some people may have heard of him. I mean, I knew him as a producer as well as a piano player, as well as a composer, an arranger. I think his biggest claim to fame was he wrote the theme song for the TV show Taxi. But he had a few albums out. I was surprised to find he was the 3rd most watched video I had posted. And here was somebody I thought, there may be a handful of people that would be actually looking for or knowing about Bob James. So that was quite a surprise to me. Number 2 was actually episode number 1. And one I entitled Album of Historical Proportions. And I'm talking about Woodstock. I mean, what do you say about Woodstock? It was the cross-section of music ending the era in the 1960s and kicking off 1970. It introduced us to bands like Joe Cocker, Santana, Crosby, Stills, and Nash & Young. It brought together rock, country, folk, all together for one day or one event, 3 days of music. But it really defined the music of that era and what was changing in music at the time. And everyone on there's a superstar. There was some great stuff and was one of my favorite albums, and it was, again, episode number 1 in our series. Which brings us to number 1. The top watched video of 2020. And again, this is one on Creed Taylor Records. Somebody that I had heard of. He had one actual hit I can think of. And I thought, you know, I'm going to put it out there because, again, a lot of great studio musicians, that same roster that Creed Taylor had been using out of New York. We'll see how many people notice it. And next thing I know, this thing took off. And even in the last week or two, I'm still getting hits and comments on it. The hit song that I'm mentioning was one called Also Sprach Zarathustra from the movie 2001. And the musician I'm talking about was Diodato, piano player, arranger, composer. Again, somebody that I thought there would be a few people might remember him from the 70s, might remember that one hit. And I couldn't get over that this was the one that really took off and more people watched than any other video I posted. So you never know. I mean, here's somebody I thought nobody would recognize, and gosh, he turned out to be the most popular there was. So that's our top 10 videos.